Good evening. This is part of the launch of the Columbia Global Reports, and we're delighted to have you with us tonight. I just want to say a very few words at the beginning of the logic of how we got to this, and then I'll turn it over to Nick Lemon, who is the creator of what we're going to experience tonight and then beyond. So there are a number of propositions behind the Columbia Global Reports, and it starts with the idea that journalism and universities are engaged in very similar enterprises. We are searching for the truth and understanding. We have a strong sense of academic freedom, of press freedom, journalistic freedom. Freedom of speech and press are integral to what we do, speaking truth to power. Great universities and great institutions of the press and journalists are engaged in very similar and very important activities. Second proposition is that the world is changing and changing rapidly and radically. And it's a world that is captured by the term globalization, a very vague term, and yet we all know that there are massive changes underway which are making us much more interdependent. Primary forces, in my view, are a global economy, the rise of markets, one of the first ever true global communications technology, the internet, along with satellites, and what we see every night on the news is a part of a bigger phenomena, which is the movements of peoples around the world. So it's the flow of goods and services and finance, it's the flow of ideas and thoughts and information, and the flow of people. These are changing our world. And the third proposition is that journalism is less able to cover this than it has been in the past. And that's in part because the business model has been eroded in its financial base by the new technologies of communication. And the response has been to close foreign bureaus and to cover crises and to move on to the next issue. But just at the moment when our world is changing radically and rapidly, we have less capacity to understand it through our institutions of journalism. Fourth proposition is universities have a responsibility to step into this void, to step in and meet this need. And we have a responsibility to adapt and to change just like other institutions do. We have a public service, public interest responsibility here. The last point really is that universities also need to adjust our own intellectual framework because of the phenomena of globalization. So we're not in any way immune from the changes. And when you're in that kind of situation, journalism is one of the best ways to do it. Because thinking about real problems, working on real problems, working quickly, and with the skills that great journalists bring to this is a way for us to educate ourselves about a new world. So for all these reasons, it seemed like a good first step to ask one of the greatest journalists of our time, and a wonderful dean of the journalism school here, Nick Lemon, to take on this project. And he came up with the idea of the Columbia Global Reports. Our journalism school, of course, is the greatest journalism school on the planet and has a number of activities that are like this, but we also think that it's important that the university, as a university, take this on. So for all of this, I want you to know is that's the thinking, that's the background, and we're very proud of what we're accomplishing with this and look forward to the discussion tonight. Thank you very much. Nick?
Thanks, Lee. I want to do a little fact check on Lee's points, which is about half of them are unassailable, and the half that are about how universities have a moral obligation to do journalism are unique to him. I am very grateful to be associated with, as far as I know, the only university president in the world who thinks journalism is part of the main basket of responsibilities of the university. It's been a great ride for these last 12 or 13 years. What we do is, Lee gave us a very broad mandate to start a news organization that covers globalization, and from there we got to doing 6 sort of novella-length works of nonfiction a year. Each is taking kind of a bite at this subject. And that gives us the ability to be in a niche that I don't think anybody else is exactly in. We're longer than magazine articles, we're shorter and much quicker off the mark than books, and we're really able to be quite ambitious on a fairly limited budget. As a sign of that, I'm going to, in 15 seconds, introduce our entire staff, and that's our publisher, Camille McDuffie, and our editor, Jimmy So, who have done a fantastic job to bring this into being. What we're trying to do here is publish things. I guess the hypothesis is most of what's going on in the world that is truly important, that doesn't take the form of an event, the press just doesn't have the bandwidth to cover, particularly if it's a kind of not obviously high box office subject. And so we're looking for things like that across a wide range. This book originated because I called Bethany, who I had known and admired for a long time. She's one of our best financial journalists, and I asked her basically 2 questions. One, what didn't get fixed since the financial crisis that people aren't aware of? What's still out there? And 2, what do you feel passionate about that's a little bit of a tough sell to, with all due respect, Graydon Carter at Vanity Fair? And the answer was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored entities that underlie the home mortgage market in the United States and have financial instruments that are traded heavily all over the world. That's all I'll say to start, and now I'll invite our panelists to come up and we'll just get started. We're going to do this very quickly, and come on up. You have assigned seats. I'll introduce you very, very briefly and ask you a couple questions, and then we'll go and I hope get to questions from the audience quickly. So thanks very much for coming. It's really encouraging to have such a full house for this subject, so it just shows that Graydon was wrong, and we're more interesting than Lady Gaga or whatever. Okay, so I'm going to sit and moderate. So let me introduce just quickly, on this side, to my left, is Franklin Raines. He is, for our purposes, I put first on his long list of accomplishments, former CEO of Fannie Mae, which is the Federal National Mortgage Association. He also was the head of OMB. He was also an investment banker at Lazard Frere and many, many other civic, government, and business activities. Bethany McLean is one of the great financial journalists in America and author of this book, which is her 3rd. The first was about the Enron scandal, which she helped break. The second was a post-mortem on the financial crisis. Bill Ackman is a well-known private investor. He's, in terms of stories the press doesn't get quite right, has a reputation as a short seller, but he would be the first to tell you he almost always takes long positions, and he's long in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac stock because he thinks it's got nowhere to go but up, right? Yeah. So he's going to tell you about that. But I want to start with Bethany just to talk a little bit about the book at the most basic level.
So I first got interested in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac way back in 2004 when I was working for Fortune magazine in the wake of an apparent and very huge accounting scandal at Fannie Mae, where their regulator likened them to a government-sponsored Enron. And I couldn't believe at that time that companies like this existed, these weird beasts, part private, part public, that were at that time 2 of the largest companies in America with trillions of dollars in mortgage-related debt outstanding, 2 of the most profitable companies in America, America that literally made up the machinery of our mortgage market, and most people didn't know they existed. And since then, I've gotten completely immersed in the weird world of the GSEs, which one person actually likened to a strange mixture of Monty Python and Shakespeare. And I promise, once you get interested in the GSEs, you'll be captivated for life.
A little bit more. So when the financial crisis happened, I'd say most non-financial people think the financial crisis started on September 15th, 2008, when Lehman Brothers went down. But in fact, like a week or 10 days before.
Right. So the first real event in the financial crisis, or at least in the final resolution of it, was when the government put these two entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, into conservatorship, arguably worsening a situation by partly wiping out private shareholders. And since then, the promise of conservatorship was that we were going to rethink how we financed home ownership in this country, and perhaps rethink even the cult of home ownership, and that was supposed to be the silver lining of the financial crisis.
What is conservatorship?
Conservatorship is a state in which the companies are supported by the government and effectively run by a government agency. They're supported by a line of credit from Treasury. The government at the time, and Bill will talk about this, left some 20% of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's securities trading because, in part, they didn't want to put the debt of these companies on the U.S. government's balance sheet. And the idea was that the companies would be reformed and wiped out of existence before this ever became a problem. But here we sit 7 years after the financial crisis, and the two companies are still in this state called conservatorship. Someone described it to me as the greatest example of political dysfunction they've seen, the inability of the government to figure out what to do with these two companies.
Why are they still in conservatorship?
It's a political impasse in Washington, D.C. I think partly the government has become addicted to the billions of dollars in profits that Fannie and Freddie are producing, which now go directly to the Treasury and have been used to reduce the budget deficit, which I think is a scandal. But I think partly there's total political impasse over what to do, how to unwind what we have, and what system would be better than the one that exists. But these two companies are politically poisonous in Washington, so the obvious solution of reforming them and keeping the system we had is also one that seems to be a non-starter.
So let me ask Frank Raines a couple questions. In the financial crisis, the government took into its embrace in various forms a number of entities, including auto companies, banks, insurance companies, and Fannie and Freddie. How come the others have been released from the embrace, but these have not?
Good question. Well, let me first say, I don't really have a dog in the current fight. I'm not an investor. I'm not suing anybody. I've won all my suits against me. I was gone 4 years before the government took it over, so I don't really have a dog in who wins this. But the best explanation, I think, for why Fannie and Freddie remain taken over by the government, nationalized essentially by the government, is first that there's a political stalemate, that the people who support what Fannie Mae does or support housing are balancing off those people, economists who think people have too much housing, or ideologues who think the government shouldn't be involved in social policy, or people who don't think the government ought to be dealing with the private companies. There's balance, and that is support status quo. Now, there was balance before, but the status quo was different. What's happened in the meantime is that the government has found a very inexpensive way to take over two of the largest companies in the country, because all of the money that they've provided to Fannie and Freddie have now been paid back. And so, but the government is continuing to own them and is able to essentially raise taxes through Fannie and Freddie without anybody calling it taxes. And so, if I were in the government, I'd say this is a pretty good deal. They got the two companies, they didn't have to pay anything for them, and they get the resources that they bring in. So that's one of the reasons that I've said for years, I don't expect any big changes in the short run, because this is a pretty good deal for the government right now.
If you could split your former selves, government's chief budget officer, CEO of Fannie Mae, and set them to arguing about which is more important, truly independent and solvent GSEs or keeping them in the government's embrace and as a source of cash for the government, which of your two personalities would win?
Well, I was actually at OMB twice, so at least I was there once before I even knew what Fannie Mae was.
Right.
And
Back in
that
the
was
Carter
during the Carter
administration.
administration, and then later, Clinton, I was the director. And I actually went through some of this debate. And it turns out when you're OMB director, you find that there's very few things that are very straightforward. The government is involved with a lot of private companies, a lot of big financial private companies. Some of them we call banks. And these banks have charters, and they've got access to government essentially guaranteed money, and they can borrow at much lower rates than anyone else. They're allowed a lot of privileges that other businesses don't have. And nobody spends any time worrying about that. That doesn't seem odd at all, because they're called banks. But if they're called anything else, then there's a higher level of suspicion. As a budget director, I looked at this as being, what's the government getting for its commitment? And what the government was getting through Fannie and Freddie was a housing policy. We haven't had a housing policy in a long time. When I was in the Carter administration, we were building 400,000 units of affordable housing every year, directly in the budget. Mm-hmm. But by the time I came back as budget director and we were negotiating the balanced budget agreement, and I was the chief negotiator for the administration, and so I was getting all the marching orders, we must have this, we must have that. No one said protect housing. No one said that should be one of our priorities, is that we need to protect housing. So housing has become a stepchild of public policy, even though I think it's one of the most important social endeavors that we have. And if we can achieve that policy through a GSE, through a Fannie and Freddie, I think that that's inexpensive, not free, but relatively inexpensive for the government.
Bill, let's start with just the basic, why are you an optimist enough to take long positions in these entities?
Maybe if I can start very big picture.
Yeah.
What's interesting, and I think what's not discussed at all, there's a lot of discussion about the shrinking middle class and the difficulty of making ends meet for many Americans. And what's enabled that construct to still work is the cost of most goods has gone down. Right? So the price of gasoline is down, the price of clothing is down, the price of computing power is down. Now the price of public education, high school is, it's free. It's part of the taxes that you pay. University education has obviously been quite expensive, but there are scholarships and there are state schools and so on and so forth. But the big inflation that's going on that people aren't focused on is in the cost of a roof over your head. And rental rates have risen at something like a 5 to 7% compounded annual rate over the last 7 or 8 years. And if you don't own a home and you're a member of the middle class, you have a problem. And you may not realize it this second, but you're going to, at continuing...
And especially if you have children who want to live in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
That's a special
but
case.
In all seriousness, this is the biggest threat to a middle-class livelihood is that your cost of living, your roof over your head is not fixed, it's floating. In fact, it's not floating, it's compounding at a relatively high rate. And what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were set up to do was effectively to make middle-class housing more accessible. And if you go back to the first you had a Great Depression. You had most of the banks in the country that made mortgage loans insolvent, and Fannie Mae was set up to, FHA and Fannie Mae were set up to address that insolvency initially. And Fannie Mae was set up to provide liquidity for FHA mortgages, that banks could make these mortgages and then monetize them. And then over time, really beginning in the late 60s, early 70s, Fannie Mae and then ultimately Freddie Mac set up this market for securitized finance. And what that did is it enabled a uniquely American financial product, which is the 30-year prepayable fixed-rate mortgage. And the 30-year prepayable fixed-rate mortgage enabled people to lock in their cost, a meaningful chunk of the cost of their housing for 30 years at a fixed rate. And by the way, if rates came down, they could reduce it even further. And that is what enabled, 2/3 of the people in the country to buy a home. And that system's been in place for, 45 years and, longer if you think about it. And the housing market is the economy, right? The housing market blew up during the financial crisis, and so did the economy. The housing market is not, fully recovered yet. There's still many markets where it's not recovered. High-end housing, the big cities, New York, whatever, obviously doing extremely well, but a lot of the country is not. And if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac disappeared tomorrow, so would the 30-year prepayable fixed-rate mortgage. And the person who owned a home that was financed with a mortgage like that, well, they'll still have their mortgage, still make their payments, but their home's going to materially decrease in value because the next guy that buys it is going to have to borrow on a 5-year basis, on a 10-year basis, at much, much higher rates. And in the old days, you couldn't borrow an amortizing mortgage. You could borrow, for 5 years or 10 years, then the payment would come due, and if there was no financial market, you were in foreclosure, and that's what happened during the Depression. So I think the Congress, I think people generally understand that once you have this 30-year prepayable fixed-rate mortgage thing for middle-class housing, you can't really get rid of it, otherwise you're going to blow up the entire housing market, and with the housing market, it's going to go the economy. The economy's weak as it is. So then the question is, how do we maintain this market? And the question is there an alternative to Fannie and Freddie? And after a fair amount of study on the topic, I believe there is no alternative for Fannie and Freddie other than an explicitly government-guaranteed housing finance system, which would add, call it $6 trillion worth of, $5-6 trillion worth of debt to the budget. And when you put the U.S. government, fundamentally in charge of something financial, in my experience, bad things happen. You look at what the status of student lending and that business, that's another crisis that's yet to fully blow up, but it will. And so the students in the audience, don't worry, you're not going to have to pay back any of these loans. They're ultimately going to be forgiven because when you guys start protesting, whenever it comes, because you can't afford the 7% interest they're charging you, ultimately those loans will have to be forgiven, kind of like many loans during the crisis. So my overall construct is we need a way to have low-cost, accessible, middle-class housing finance, and this 30-year prepayable fixed-rate mortgage is a fixture.
So what do you think will actually happen with conservatorship? How does that play out?
So first of all, this book, Shaky Ground, is a must-read, and the reason why it's a must-read is this is a complicated topic, Fannie and Freddie. No one in the Congress, very few people understand what these companies actually do and how they work, and I think very few people in the country understand it, and the book makes it easily understandable and accessible, tells the history in a very good way. So one, read the book. But two, I don't agree with Bethany in what she just said, in that I do not believe that the conservatorship was set up to provide a way to liquidate Fannie and Freddie. The conservatorship, if you look at the public statements at the time, this was a resting place to put Fannie and Freddie for them to be recapitalized and be put back into the world. And the reason why the public shareholders were left with 20% of the company was because the alternative, first of all, if you think about the Fannie and Freddie at the time, the government negotiated this preferred stock purchase agreement to inject capital into Fannie and Freddie, and they negotiated with the board of directors. If you go to a board of directors and tell them, we're going to inject money at a 10% coupon, we're going to take 79.9% of your company for free, there's something at least to negotiate for as a fiduciary. If they came in and said, look, we're going to inject $185 billion of capital, and we're going to take 100% of the common stock of the business, and nothing will be left with your shareholders, there's not a member of a board who could agree to a transaction like that as a fiduciary. And so they left something for the owners because to have something that the board could say, hey, look, we had very few alternatives, but at least it was expensive financing. There's a hope certificate for the owners of the business. And so the conservatorship has done a very good job rehabilitating the companies. So much so that Fannie and Freddie by 2012 were enormously profitable and on their way to generating enormous revenues. And someone in the government, maybe a friend of Bethany's, decided that, we can't let the shareholders get anything. And I suspect there'll be lots of interesting emails between perhaps the White House and other people saying, look, we can't let the speculators, the shareholders get anything, Fannie and Freddie, we've got to get rid of them. The government came in and literally expropriated 2 private companies by taking 100% of the profits forever from both companies. This is the most illegal act of scale I've seen the U.S. government ever do, and there is no way it will be allowed to stand from a legal point of view. And the reason for that is if the U.S. government can step in and take 100% of the profits of a corporation forever, then we are in a Stalinistic state, and no private property is safe, and take your money out of every financial institution, put it into gold, Bitcoin and just get the hell out because we're done. Maybe you're closing your back. Other than that, nothing's safe. So I think this is going to be reversed, and there's a lot of legal progress. But I'll give you 2 more minutes on what I think, why I'm optimistic, which was your original question, but it requires some context. So the reason why I'm optimistic is, one, I believe in the rule of law in the United States, and private property cannot be expropriated without just compensation. But that's not all that I believe. I believe there is no viable alternative to Fannie and Freddie in order to preserve the 30-year prepayable fixed-rate mortgage. And the reason why I believe that is, there are a bunch of different proposals on alternatives, Corker Warner, these other bills. They want to set up 10 mini Fannie Freddies. The assumption is the private sector will recapitalize them, and we're going to raise $500 billion from private investors. It's never going to happen. So number one, who's going to invest in the next mini Fannie Freddie when the last shareholders got, I can't use the expression in front of this group of people, but
Done too.
yes. They got screwed. I guess I was thinking something worse than that. And so no one's going to ever invest in a new government-sponsored anything if this is what happens to shareholders. But the second thing is these two companies have the benefit of enormous incumbency advantage. Right? They've got $5 trillion of mortgages outstanding and mortgage-backed securities. These securities have performed extremely well. They're owned by the Chinese, the Russians, and probably the Syrians, many of our enemies, many of our friends, and people think of them as safe instruments, and they are. And as a result, and because they're done in enormous scale with extreme degree of liquidity, they trade at very small spreads to other instruments, and that has enabled the cost of housing finance to be a very low cost. So for a relatively modest sum, which is today 60 basis points per annum, these two companies guarantee mortgages and have provided an enormous amount of liquidity to the housing market. A startup can't do that. A startup does not have the market position, the scale, the capital, the credibility. It took 70 years to build it. So you've got what amounts to a duopoly with enormous scale, and that's the scale economies they generate by virtue of that means that no one else can effectively compete at a cost that's competitive. So the two choices are Fannie and Freddie, or a government-guaranteed housing market, or your mortgages, instead of costing 3.5% today, will cost 7%. And once the mortgages go to 7%, there won't be anyone left in the Congress or the Senate because every American will maybe some people think that's a good thing, but they'll be gone because no one can tolerate it. And the housing values will drop by 25 or 30%. So what I think ultimately happens here is the original bargain of the conservatorship will be preserved, which is the government injected capital and took their pound of flesh, 10% coupon, 79.9% of the equity. That was a fair deal at the time. It was a tough deal. It was negotiated. There was a board of directors, and they selected that bargain. If you preserve that bargain and you credit the payments that have been made to the government, this $240 billion that it's been paid, and you credit it first to the 10% interest payment and next to a principal pay down, almost like when you paid your mortgage back on an accelerated basis, there would be today about $44 billion of the original commitment outstanding. So the government has $44 billion. If you preserve the original bargain, there should be $44 billion in preferred outstanding. The government owns 79.9% of both institutions. These companies are enormously profitable. They're going to continue to be enormously profitable. Those profits, the company should not pay any dividends until those profits accrete to a sufficient level of capital to make these institutions, like what Jamie Dimon calls, have fortress balance sheets. And Fannie and Freddie become, like as Frank Rain says, like the banking system. The banking system, the government will step in and save J.P. Morgan if the capital gets wiped out. But the government what did the government do during the crisis? It injected capital in each of these institutions. It restricted their ability to do risky things, the Volcker Rule and so on. They required them to hold a lot more capital to run their business. They watched them much more carefully. And then ultimately the government exited by selling its preferred stock, selling its warrants, and it's now a privately held enterprise. But it's still government-sponsored in effect. The government's ultimately a backstop. And the only question in my mind about Fannie and Freddie should be, what businesses should they be allowed to be in? And the answer is only one, the business of guaranteeing timely interest and principal payments on mortgages. They should be out of this fixed income arbitrage business, which they're in the process of winding down. And then the second question is, how much capital should they hold so that the probability of the government having to step in and save them in the future is de minimis? And those are that's really the only relevant question. I think that's where we'll end up. And the last point I'll make is affordable housing is important to a lot of people in the country, and as I point out, it's a critical issue. It's going to become even more critical as the economic divide gets gets wider, Fannie and Freddie can be part of the affordable housing solution to a very material extent, and the best time for the government to negotiate a deal on affordable housing is in the current state. So as a largest shareholder of Fannie and Freddie, I would sit down tomorrow with whomever, give me someone to negotiate with, Treasury Secretary, the President, or his delegates, and make a deal where affordable housing is preserved forever. Perhaps they own a piece of Fannie and Freddie, perhaps they get a percentage of the dividends that are paid to shareholders, perhaps there's some, we create some ongoing subsidy to promote a housing policy that makes sense, and there's a lot of room between what these companies are ultimately worth and where the stocks trade today for a bargain to happen which preserves affordable housing, which protects the taxpayer, and the bottom line is the taxpayer owns 79.9% of both companies. And so the taxpayer injected $185 billion of capital, about $45 billion of that has been interest payments. They're going to get another $45 billion from the principal that's outstanding, plus interest. And then they're going to own 79.9% of two institutions that we estimate will have a market value in about 5 years of $500 billion. So there's another $400 billion in equity that's owned by the taxpayer that can be used for infrastructure, deficit reduction, national debt reduction. Let's fight over the proceeds from the profits of the sale of the government's interest in these two companies, and let's discuss how much money should be allocated, how much of the value should be allocated to affordable housing or dividends going forward, and then we can preserve the rule of law and everyone wins. Once I thought of this, I concluded there was no other viable alternative, and that's why I bought the stock. So that's a short version.
Let me ask Frank Raines to respond immediately, and since we're in a university, we can throw around these $10 words. So normatively and descriptively. Normatively, do you agree with Bill that preserving widespread single-family home ownership falls sort of under the heading of American exceptionalism is a good idea? Descriptively, do you think the scenario he just described for unwinding the conservatorship is an attractive and likely one?
Well, I certainly believe that home ownership is a vital part of the American experience, and that it's a vital part of wealth generation in the United States and in most countries around the world. If you look, my father never earned more than $15,000 a year. My mother also earned about $15,000 a year at the peak. This is in their peak year. When they died, they were living on Social Security, but they died with an estate of $200,000. $195,000 was equity in their home. The average American has a net worth of about $100,000. African Americans, it's more like $20,000, and for what's higher. But almost all of that is built around home ownership. We now have 401ks and other things, but almost all of it's built around home ownership. It's the one way that the working class and middle class people can have leverage work for them, and it's a form of forced savings, where every month they're paying down that principal, and they're owning a little bit more. So I do believe it's vitally important, and I think that those who think that housing is just consumption are just wrong. It's not been our experience. It's not my experience. It is not simply consumption. It is about building wealth. It's about being able to have a sense of ownership. It's about having stable communities. It's a lot more than just consumption. In terms of what do I think will happen, I think that's one of the scenarios. That's a logical scenario. I think it's a hopeful scenario. But having been around the politics in Washington and of Fannie Mae, it may be an overly optimistic scenario. I think the government will only agree to that path if a court makes one of three decisions. Either decides that the government's abusing its authority in terms of being a conservator, that they're not really rehabilitating the companies, that they just really want to keep them, or concludes that the takeover was a nationalization, or third, interestingly, there's a lawsuit that's now pending that claims that the agreement itself, the preferred stock agreement with this Third Amendment, is illegal because under Delaware law, you can't have preferred stock that takes all of the profits. Now, if that's illegal, it could easily force the kind of negotiation I think the bill's talking about. And don't be surprised if a court does that. Years ago, there was something called WPSS, the Washington Public Power Supply System, that had issued $2 or $3 billion of bonds that had been approved by a very important New York law firm. Incidentally, not a Washington State law firm, but a New York law firm. And when the project got in trouble, the state Supreme Court had no difficulty saying, you know, by the way, those bonds were void at the moment they were issued. And $3 billion that had been invested by investors went away. So it's not impossible that a Delaware court could conclude that the Treasury was too smart by half and force the kind of negotiation I think the bill's talking about happening. But I think the politics of this are so difficult because the stakes are so high. That value that you were talking about, there are a lot of people, many of them in this town, who are eyeing that value for themselves. And they don't think they need Fannie and Freddie to get it. And that's why some of us view this whole process as a process of mortgage wars that are going on over ideology, over economics, economic theory, and as well as competition.
If you could design the ideal system with no political constraints to guarantee home ownership, and you didn't exactly say, but I'm assuming you agree with Bill about stipulating 30-year fixed-rate repayable home mortgages, what would that system look like?
Well, if I tried to do something that I thought was also practical, you know, that we can get there from where we are, the first thing I would do is probably rename Fannie and Freddie, maybe something like Brad and Angelina. So we could say that Fannie and Freddie are gone. No one needs to fight the fight over Fannie and Freddie, they're gone. And then I would just try to use the mechanisms we've already got. I think, as Bill was saying, there's so much value in what Fannie and Freddie have in terms of their systems and knowledge and intellectual property that you want to build off of them. So whatever system, they ought to participate in that system. Second, I think you do need to get the breadth of investor interest and the continuing investor interest. You need some kind of a guarantee. But we have an entity that does guarantees of mortgage-backed securities. It's called Ginnie Mae, and they guarantee securities of FHA and VA loans. Ginnie Mae can provide their guarantee to issuances by Angelina and Brad and other entities that will provide that government guarantee without a new government entity. Now, if you try to capitalize these new entities at a level that says there will never be a bailout, then they cannot operate effectively because you can't capitalize against black swan events.
I disagree.
I don't think you can capitalize against the world ending, which is essentially what a lot of people are saying. But what you can do, instead of saying that these entities are going to carry all that capital, is to have them carry the capital to meet normal losses in normal economic conditions, but then build up a fund like the FDIC has for banks, and build up that fund from people who are getting mortgages, and have that fund sitting there ready in the case we have another one of these events. So that way the government and the taxpayer are protected, but you don't try to force all of that capital onto these entities. And so have multiples of them. I think you could do that tomorrow, and you would have a fully guaranteed security with capitalization in place that was appropriate for it, build up that fund, and I think you could go forward. I agree you don't need to continue the portfolios. But I also would say that anyone who wants to participate, would have to participate on the same terms that Fannie and Freddie were participating. But I think you could do that. That's something that's doable. It doesn't require creating something that no one's ever seen before. It's economically viable and something that I think, as time goes on, and as we get into the 10th year we may begin to see people looking at it.
Let me just ask one other thing of everybody, and then I want to ask one question of Bethany, and then we'll go to audience questions. So since he got reelected, President Obama's been taking on various, issues nobody wants to touch, like normalization with Cuba and the Iran deal. Is there any chance that he'll say, let's get out ahead of the court system and just do the right thing here, however he construes it, in his last year plus in office?
Do you want me to answer that?
Anybody, yeah.
I think the administration has painted itself into a bit of a corner because they have said repeatedly, and President Obama has said repeatedly, we've got to get rid of Fannie and Freddie, and we want a system where private capital comes first and takes most of the mortgage risk. And I think the big thing that nobody talks about is what's private capital? Well, they mean the banking system. Per Frank's point, is the banking system really private capital? The big banks had to get bailed out in the financial crisis, just like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did. I think they're all government-sponsored entities, and I'm not sure why putting mortgage risk into the banking system equates to a safer system than having an independent agencies that take that mortgage
So he
risk.
can't come up with a solution that continues Fannie and Freddie because he's already stated that that isn't his position.
He would have to back off his pre-existing position in order to do
Do you want to jump in on
that.
this, Bill?
Sure. So I think that a few things. Number one, Fannie and Freddie, the brand is extremely valuable. And what I mean by that is making fun a little bit of Brad and Angelina idea. But these are securities where there are trillions of dollars of outstanding obligations that trade every day, and hundreds of billions of dollars of these securities trade. It took 45 years to develop that market. You can't start a new one tomorrow. If you change the names, it will confuse the marketplace, and it will, I believe, lead to much higher spreads in where they trade, and therefore much higher costs for the mortgage amount. President Obama, if what he's looking for is a solution where private capital takes the first loss risk, Fannie and Freddie are the answer. The question simply is how much equity, how much private capital should Fannie and Freddie hold so that the probability of the government having to step in becomes de minimis? I believe that is a calculable value. We've had the benefit of going through one of the worst housing crises. If you look back on what happened in '08, Fannie and Freddie took $240 billion worth of provisions, which obviously wiped them out, but they've actually have had to reverse 140 billion of the 240. So the company's over-reserved. And there's all kinds of conspiracy theorists who say why the company's over-reserved at the time. They took $100 billion of losses. They took $100 billion of losses because, among other things, they were pushed very hard to guarantee, non-creditworthy borrowers, buy private label securities and subprime securities. If they simply go back to the core business, which is what they've been doing for the last 7 years, of guaranteeing first mortgages for creditworthy middle-class borrowers, that's a business that over 45 years, the losses were between 3 and 11 basis points. They charge a 60 basis points guarantee fee. There's a huge spread for them to earn an attractive return on a much greater amount of capital. We believe the right amount of capital here, conservatively, is 250 basis points of capital. Again, getting out of what caused Fannie and Freddie a problem was not the core guarantee business that they were in. It's the fact that management went off the reservation in two ways. One, they wanted to build this, what amounted to just an arbitrage business. They realized they could, if you think of the core Fannie Freddie business, it was an insurance company. It guaranteed the timely payment of interest and principal on a 30-year mortgage where the losses were 3 to 11 basis points per annum, an incredibly low-risk insurance business. But where mistakes were made, where they realized they could issue their own debt at spreads very close to treasuries. So Fannie and Freddie designed a bunch of look-alike U.S. government instruments, issued commercial paper, unsecured debt, short-term and longer-term obligations, and they borrowed money for free, and then they went and bought securities and kept the spread, and they levered up 40 to 1 in that business. And that business was designed to generate more earnings. There was not a social purpose for that business, and it was an abuse, in my opinion, of what they were originally set up to do. That's what caused the problem. The problem with that business is enormous liquidity risk because you have to constantly access the market, so confidence is important. Enormous interest rate risk. There's no interest rate risk in the core Fannie Freddie business of guaranteeing timely payment of interest and principal. So if you go back to the core business, which they're in the process of doing, the conservator has been winding down this asset business, and you go back to this really safe business of guaranteeing mortgages for creditworthy borrowers, these are incredibly low-risk enterprises, and they don't need to hold a huge amount of capital. And that's where you could take the government out of the business, where the government would be a second loss position, but they'd be after a ton of capital. And even if we had the same problem over again, we'd have more than twice the capital we need during one of the great 100-year floods. I think that's a reasonable position to be in. So I think we can get there. And the last thing I would say is, why would the Obama administration get involved before the upcoming election, being at risk of doing something that could be criticized for? Well, the risk now is the litigation's made meaningful progress. In the discovery, it appears that Fairholme has identified a serious number of documents and government officials that have lied under oath about what they knew at the time the takeover took place. And it looks like this was a political takeover as opposed to one that's economically justified. If that gets traced back to senior levels of the Obama administration, that's a very bad thing for the Democrats in the upcoming election. Much better off being part of the solution than being caught holding the bag in terms of the takeover of these institutions. And that might motivate a sensible administration to come to an answer that preserves affordable housing, takes the government out of the housing finance system, at least many layers removed. So I think it's possible, although I'm not betting it's going to take place.
Well, that's a segue to, this will be the last question before we go to your questions. Bethany, quickly, so far I'm pretty convinced that this is kind of important. We're in full swing of a presidential election. I think, if Rick Perry's out and Biden is sort of in, we're at about 20 candidates. I'm not aware of any candidate mentioning this issue. I don't know if I'm missing something. Why isn't this dog barking?
I think there are two things. I think, one, it's incredibly complicated, and you, Frank, have talked a little bit about trying to explain to politicians what Fannie and Freddie actually did. And so it's part of this hidden machinery that makes our world work, and people prefer to ignore it until it hits them over the head, and they say, oh, wow, this is really important, and then people prefer to forget it until they're reminded again that it's really, really important. I also think it is really controversial, in part because a narrative arose in Washington, D.C. after the financial crisis that has gained remarkable power, which is that Fannie and Freddie alone, in their mandate to provide affordable housing, was the sole cause of the financial crisis. And there are many ways you can disprove this narrative, but it doesn't really matter in D.C. The two companies have become political poison. So what is the rational solution? And I agree with Bill. I think the only solution, which is a reconstituted form of these two companies, has become politically very, very unpalatable. So it's hard for anybody who knows anything finds very quickly that they can't talk about the issue in political talking points because the political talking points stop making sense. So people gain interest, politicians gain interest in the topic for a few minutes, and then once they acquire a little bit of knowledge, they realize, oh, this doesn't conform to my talking points. I think I better just let this go. So
there
I
is a
think that's
talking
the
point.
issue.
Well,
Frank?
I wish that some of the candidates would talk about housing and the importance of housing.
Right.
But I'm actually also hope they don't talk about Fannie and Freddie. The last time it was mentioned in a political campaign, I became the Willie Hogan of the
Willie Horton.
Willie Horton of the political world. With my face on ads, and poor women, little old ladies were trembling, looking at this terrible guy, because they want to use, if they say anything at all about Fannie and Freddie, it will become a way for them to attack Wall Street and financial services without going after other people.
Right.
It's a backdoor way of saying, oh, look, this is Enron, I'm against that. I'll stand up to those bad guys. And the more that they put themselves into the corner, that Fannie and Freddie must die, and that's the only possible outcome, then we'll be stuck. Fannie and Freddie, in my view, are not going to die, because we're not going to shut down our housing system. But it will take time before the political system can bring itself to do anything that someone could accuse as being positive to Fannie and Freddie. That's why I mention the Brad and Angelina. Right. It's all about optics at that stage. It's all about, I didn't do anything for Fannie and Freddie, I did something for housing. Right. And Fannie and Freddie are gone. These other entities are there, but Fannie and Freddie are gone because the optics matter a lot. And in a presidential campaign, as far as I can see, the only way this will come up is as a surrogate for attacking Wall Street. And I think that's not helpful.
Actually,
Quick comment.
very quick. So one point I'd just like to make, and I think this is not well understood, the largest financial institution in the world by far is Fannie. If you think of Fannie and Freddie as one entity, they have approaching $6 trillion of outstanding liabilities. How much capital do they hold against those liabilities? The answer is zero. And that is a stunning fact, right? So if you think about what causes the financial crisis, the cause of the financial crisis were large, highly levered financial institutions that did not have adequate capital relative to the risks they were exposed to. You could say Fannie and Freddie didn't have enough capital going into the crisis, but here we are, it's 7 years after the crisis, and because of the government's expropriation of 100% of the profits of these entities, which the government books as income on the government income statement, right, the taxpayer income statement offsetting debts, you've got a bank or a very large financial institution, largest in the world, that literally has no capital because each quarter, as they generate a profit, the government steps in and takes all of that money, books it as income. So it's actually a massive accounting fraud if you think about it. In all seriousness, right? You're booking the dividends from Fannie and Freddie as if it's income. You have a financial institution that should be holding hundreds of billions of dollars of capital that has zero.
So,
and I think if I'm a Republican running for office and I want to attack the Democrats, I would attack that. It's irresponsible to allow the largest financial institution in the world to hold no capital. If I, period.
So I think one thing, come on up to the mic to ask questions, and while you're walking, I'll say we can all agree that we've found ourselves one of those important stories that's not sufficiently covered in the press, right?
Thank you,
I'm
Columbia.
sold on that. Sir.
My name is Gary Hines. I'm from Wilmington, Delaware. Hello, Bethany. I saw you earlier today. And I happen to be the co-plaintiff in the Delaware action. And we are very encouraged by the fact, and Mr. Rings, I think you said it a moment ago, that when they put this deal together, they were a little bit too smart by half. Mm-hmm. And nobody sat in Washington, and they are the brightest people in the world, but they do make mistakes. And nobody sat down and thought, gee, I wonder if there's a state law implication here. And there is, because under Delaware law, you cannot have a class of stock, and this is plain vanilla, I mean, there's nothing special about this. You can't have a class of stock that takes 100% of the profits and leaves nothing for anybody else. It's just absolutely illegal. And it's not me saying it. I'm represented, and my co-plaintiff is represented by a guy named Myron Steele, who I've known for 40 years. Myron is the former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court. If anybody knows Delaware law, he does. And so we're very, very confident about that part of the case. The other thing I'd like to say, and I came in a little bit late, so I'm not sure if it's been talked about, but as I've looked at this case, and Bill, you might want to comment on this, I agree with you that the original deal, 10% coupon on the preferred, and the what we call on Wall Street the sweetener of 79.9% of the equity, which could be worth another $400 to $500 billion for the Treasury. A lot of shareholders don't like that deal, but I think that that's a fair deal. But that having been said, the more I've looked into the original circumstances under which the first deal was made, not the Third Amendment, it's clear, very clear, that these companies, despite the narrative that's been put out about being bailed out to the tune of whatever the number happens to be, is false, because they never needed a bailout. Folks, it's always follow the money. And if you follow the money, you will find that they were taken over in order to be used as a vehicle by the government to buy mortgage-backed securities in the fall of 2008 from the banks that were illiquid, and they were used as a vehicle to liquefy the big banks. Now that, when I first heard that, I thought, oh, this is a great conspiracy theory. But I've done the homework since, and it's true. Now that's not to say that that was not the right thing to do at the time. The building was falling, was burning down. You've got to put out the fire. You can't argue, should I use water or a chemical retardant? You got to put out the fire. And if that's what they had to do at the time to save the system, I understand. But to then come back when all those phony, what I call cookie jar accounting entries, which were paper losses, had to be reversed, and then say, oh, now we want 100% of the profit. I mean, that, Bill, I could not agree with you more, that it's so un-American. And I am astonished that the Republicans, whose bedrock principle is private property rights, have turned a blind eye to this. If they can get away with this, as Bill said, put your money somewhere else, because if they can do this to Fannie and Freddie, they can do this to any bank or a financial institution or insurance company in the United States. Very dangerous. Actually, that's not a question.
Okay. Well, appreciate good speech anyway, and thank you. Next, and I hope this is a question.
This is a question. So my name is Nathaniel Byerly. I'm the co-president of the Finance Society here at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. My question is basically based off a lot of the conversation that we've had here. We've heard a lot about how the government has been either inept, or as sometimes we've heard, an accounting fraud. And so my real question is on the practical side, not the political aspects or the making it look nice aspects. Really, is it practical to unwind this conservatorship arrangement? Or are we just going to run into other issues of fraud, right, or just poor management, just another, by trying to change from the status quo, are we just looking to create more problems at the end of the day?
No. It's actually, first of all, I have to say that the management of Fannie and Freddie and the conservators to date have actually done a phenomenal job in running these two institutions since they, from the beginning of the takeover, the conservatorship, to the present, and they deserve kind of a round of applause for that. These are two critically important institutions. They did a fabulous job. And interestingly, there's a bill that I think is going to fail, but a bill to where there was going to be 100% support from the Senate to not allow the management to get paid bonuses. There's nothing more dangerous than having the largest financial institution in the world run by a group of executives who are paid 80% below market. So I do think the real risk here on a longer term basis is an issue of retaining talented employees because of the limbo state of the enterprises. And there are lots of examples of these very large pools of capital globally, more on the pension side, that are managed by executives that get paid very low dollars relative to market because it's just politically the union or doesn't want to pay them enough, and bad things come from it. This is an example where you've had a group of really underpaid members of the management of this company who've done a phenomenal job with the business, and we have as Americans we have a lot to thank for that, but it's not a sustainable situation. And the conservator recently approved these bonuses, and it's a really easy thing for a bunch of politicians to get together and say, look, we're standing up for the country by not allowing these executives to get paid $1 million bonuses. But you know what? If it's a competitive world and you're going to lose this talent and it's critical, the bill looks like it's likely to fail because Elizabeth Warren has come out against it because there have been some add-ons to what was originally just about compensation to make some changes that would kill the ability for affordable housing and so on and so forth. But I think the simple answer to your question is they can exit conservatorship with a stroke of a pen. I don't think it does not require a vote of Congress. The conservator has the authority, and it could happen.
Just to add on to that a tiny bit, when I was doing my reporting, a former senior official at FHA said to me, you do not want these things nationalized and being run by the government. We're slow-moving, we're a bureaucracy, we're competing in one of the fastest-moving, most aggressive, most competitive markets in the world, which is the mortgage market. And if you think you can nationalize these companies and have them not get their, I'll use a politer expression, have them not get their faces ripped off by the Wall Street players with whom they're interacting on a daily basis, you're crazy. And I thought that was an interesting argument coming from someone who was formerly at the FHA.
I think that's right. There's a limited amount of talent to do a lot of these things. When I was at Fannie Mae, we had 5,000 employees. 2,000 were in technology. And if you don't pay the market rate, the technologists are just going to go where they're going to go. If they're not doing interesting work, they're going to go where they're going to go. So over time, if you really do turn these things into HUD, you're just not going to have the kind of people, putting aside the financial people who are vital, but just on the day-to-day basis of getting top quality people to do these things. And remember, conservatorship was meant to be short-term. It was meant to rehabilitate a company and then send them back out. The only strange thing that's going on here is that there's been way too little rehabilitation and no talk about setting them out. The rest of it is pretty normal. I mean, the FDIC has rehabilitated and put institutions in conservatorship and rehabilitated them in the past. The one thing I would say, I just want to add in terms of the unusual nature of this and why it's causes a lot of people a lot of concern and suspicion, is If you look at the numbers, essentially Fannie Mae, from its capital and its earnings since the crisis, it's basically earned enough to pay all of its debt. All of the losses were paid out of either capital or from revenue, and which is what you expect. So clearly, what they had was a concern that people that they would run out of money, that they would have a crisis, and that's why the government needed to come in. But the government had another instance of this with AIG. Very similar problem. AIG had a lot of assets, but they weren't in cash, and they had to pay out a lot of obligations. So the government basically said, you've got the assets, you just don't have the cash. We'll make a deal with you, get you to the end point. We're going to take a lot of the company as a result, but eventually AIG, you're going to be a private company. The odd thing that causes people concern is, why wasn't Fannie and Freddie given that same deal? You didn't have to invent a whole new deal. Why didn't you just have the same deal that you had with AIG, where it was a cash flow issue? I mean, one little secret that that never been talked about is that all those loans that Fannie Mae has on their books, Bill doesn't like it being on the books, and I disagree with him on some of his analysis, none of them were pledged. None. They were all free and clear assets. The Federal Reserve could have loaned $200 billion to Fannie Mae
on a secured basis.
On a completely secured basis. They decided not to do that. So those are the kinds of things that cause people questions as to why did the government do what it did?
Let's go to, you'll be our last question because we're almost out of time.
Thanks for the great discussion. My name is Mohit Chan. I'm a senior in Columbia College. My question is also about conservatorship as an option during financial crises. During the financial crises, we saw several companies enter conservatorship but then reemerge as valuable entities. My question is conservatorship an effective option, and are there any other options? And what type of value does a company retain after it enters into conservatorship and once it leaves conservatorship?
I'm happy to take that one if that works. So actually brings up another, one of the other amicus briefs that was filed by the former chairman of the FDIC. And conservatorship is actually, this wasn't some novel idea to put Fannie and Freddie in conservatorship. It's actually the process by which the government, the FDIC, rehabilitates financial institutions that get into trouble. And there have been hundreds of conservatorships where the FDIC chair and the FDIC itself presides over what happens. And what happens is the FDIC steps in, it puts the entity in sort of a state of suspense and works to maximize the value of the assets, minimize the liabilities, and preserve value for all of the stakeholders. Now, in many of the FDIC banking conservatorships, because financial institutions are leveraged, what happens is they generate a lot of value, but there isn't enough left for the shareholders or the preferred stockholders or the unsecured bondholders or perhaps the senior creditors, but they maximize the value of the assets and they distribute the proceeds, maintaining kind of the hierarchy of claims so that each person gets what they're entitled to. And the reason why that process is really important is that banks get into trouble and they require injections of capital at various times because of changes in the economy. And when that happens, there are investors who are willing to lend money on a distressed basis or inject preferred capital on a distressed basis. It often comes senior to the common stockholders. It often has, fairly onerous terms. But they know that they're making a bet that there's enough enterprise value in the institution that they're going to earn their return on their investment and get back their capital. And the reason, what gives them the comfort is that the conservatorship process is there's a lot of history behind conservatorships, and the FDIC behaves in a consistent manner in the way they deal with it, and investors are treated fairly. And the amicus brief that was filed in the appeal by the former chairman of the FDIC, and he basically made a very important point. He said, well, first of all, the Fannie Freddie conservatorships are almost word for word stolen from the FDIC conservatorship model. And if it becomes settled law that the U.S. government can step into a conservatorship and expropriate 100% of the profits of the financial institution forever, no one will ever again provide rescue capital for any financial institution. Forget about Fannie and Freddie, but think about all the community banks, all the middle-sized banks that get into trouble during great economic recessions. Fannie and Freddie sold something like $25 billion worth of preferred stock in the months leading up to the conservatorship. Why did those investors put in $25 billion of capital to help rescue these institutions? Because again, they assumed that they would be treated fairly, right? there's not a penny of capital that will go into a distressed bank if what happens here is that this becomes settled law, that in a conservatorship, the government can take 100% of the profits forever. So the answer to your question is, if you have a good conservator and they focus on maximizing the assets of the institution, minimizing liabilities, and preserving value in the order of claims for the senior-most creditors, depositors first typically, and then the creditors and the bondholders, and ultimately the equity holders, then depending on how well that process is managed, depending on what's going on in the world and how badly the bank was run, there could be a recovery for shareholders or not. Here what you have is fundamentally a very, very high-quality business that's been managed extremely well through the conservatorship. We have the benefit of a housing recovery. We have the benefit of the market power of these institutions and the market share that they have, and the fact that, frankly, another really important point is no one has chosen to enter this business, right? You know, the bank's market share of mortgages went from 30 to 31%, okay, over the last 7 years. It's not growing to replace Fannie and Freddie. In fact, the market share of Fannie and Freddie has only gotten larger. And so when you have institutions with this kind of franchise value that are really profitable, actually there's going to be money left for the shareholders. And that's a good thing, because if there's money left for the shareholders, there's also money left for the $25 billion of preferred stockholders to put money in. That means there's going to be money to bail out from the private sector the next financial institution that gets into trouble. But if the court decision, you know, if Fannie and Freddie, the government's allowed to take 100% of the profits forever, no one's going to put $1 of capital in a rescue situation, and it's going to cost people a real question whether they're willing to put $1 of capital into any financial institution. At an absolute minimum, it's going to meaningfully increase the cost of capital of every bank in the country, because who's going to buy preferred stock in a bank if this is what can happen to you in a conservatorship? So lots of interesting stuff to discuss here. They limited us.
Yeah, we've got to.
I've only paid
we're
50. What's the minimum wage now? $9.50.
Yeah.
And we only got $9.50.
We're a little over our
Extra
time.
$5 will go
We
on for
do
half an
have an immediately following reception in the room right behind us. I don't know if you guys are coming or not, but I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions. But whoever is going to be at the reception of us can field them. So thanks very, very much for joining us. It was a great session. You're free.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Who would have believed it actually came and stayed?